Welcome everybody. Christina, oh, you already beat me to it, ready to go. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Shauna Corey, and welcome to the second to last Bench to Market talk of this year. Go ahead and advance the slide, Christina. Okay. Oh, there we go. So for those of you who are interested, we have our final session of the year. It will be June 3rd, and it's going to be a MedTech funder perspective. So we're going to have a panel of VCs from certainly across the Southeast, maybe across the country, who will be joining us for a candid conversation about what happens after you leave the room when you give a VC pitch, what they look for, what are red flags, and really take a look behind the curtain there. So we've already confirmed an associate from Sante Ventures, and so these will be people with funds that are actively putting money to work, even in the era of COVID and medical technologies. And it says medtech, but we'll also be discussing therapeutics investment and health IT and the like. So June 3rd, mark your calendar. The link is there. I think Christina may also drop it into the chat. So if you haven't registered yet, go ahead and do that. And we will be bringing the Bench to Market talks. We'll be bringing them back in collaboration with the Georgia CTSA in the fall. So we'll start back up in September. So keep an eye out for that once we get on the other side of summer as well. Next slide. Well, I think I know what it says. Oh, yep, there it goes. So for those of you who don't know, Biolocity is one of the 13 BARDA DRIVE Accelerator Network members, and we serve as a conduit to increase visibility both for startups to BARDA, and for BARDA to get to see technologies and startups that are in their areas of strategic interest. And as I'm sure you can imagine, BARDA, the group that manages a lot of the US's medical countermeasure technology development and procurement, they're very active right now, and they have some specific areas of interest. So you can check out the BARDA Easy BAA, their full Big BARDA BAA, and more information. Definitely encourage you to check out the medicalcountermeasures.gov database if you have a technology that you think has a role to play in the COVID-19 response. That medicalcountermeasures.gov link is used by the whole intergovernmental task force to help identify technologies. So the FDA is looking at that, BARDA is looking at that, even NIH is looking at it. If you have any questions, you can also request a meeting via the Biolocity website, and we'd be happy to talk to you more and help maybe give you a better understanding of the difference in some of these funding mechanisms and opportunities. And that's biolocity.org. Next slide. We are joined today by Dr. James Stubbs. He is a professor of the practice here at Georgia Tech, where he helps lead the BME capstone program along with James Rains, but he is also a serial medtech entrepreneur himself, done a little bit of angel investing here and there, and is a good friend and a great advisor. I've seen him give this talk before, and it's really helpful. This is kind of the other side of the coin to the session we'll be doing in June. So from a founder's perspective, what does investment mean? What does dilution mean? And how does the ownership over a company change over a period of time? Some opportunities for you guys. We'd like to keep these sessions very interactive, although we may be in a virtual format. So really encourage you to use the Q&A function. If you have questions as they come up, we're going to pause at the end of various slides or various topics, and I'll be able to ask James your questions there. And without further ado, James, I'll turn it over to you. But definitely be active in the Q&A, guys. We like to keep these sessions really interactive.
Great, thank you. So, hi, I'm James, and I'm going to try to share my screen and see if we can't get the ball rolling here. All right, so hopefully everybody sees the actual full slide, not the other part of it. So what I wanted to do is I changed this topic up just a little bit from what Shauna has seen before, way back in the early days when she was in MBID, because I wanted to get rid of some of the things that if you're doing a startup company, particularly in medical devices, but any type of startup company, there's some things that, some corporate structures and things like that are just, they're not of any use. If you're really going to get investor money, there's a narrower set of structures and things that are necessary. So we're going to concentrate on that aspect of it. So I'm going to get started and tell you a little bit more about me. And I'm only doing this because I want you to understand where I'm coming from, because I have a fairly limited perspective. And so I just want everybody to understand what my biases are and where I'm coming from. So as Shauna mentioned, I'm a professor of the practice, which I'm not really sure what that means. Maybe I need more practice doing professor type stuff, but that's what they call me. I'm also on the board currently of 2 privately held investor-backed companies in the medical device space. I'm also the CEO and chairman of Radiation Dosimetry Systems, which is a company I've run for a long time, and we mainly do radioactive drug services and software development in that. My first foray into medical device entrepreneurship started with Proxima Therapeutics, and I came on board as a director of scientific affairs and so forth, and rose all the way up to the CTO in that. And I saw that from the inception through 5 rounds of financing all the way up to an acquisition. And that was, and I'll show you a little bit about some of the products that we did. That company was acquired by Cytec Surgical Products. They moved me out to Palo Alto, California, and they kept me around and everybody out there for about 15 months. And then they decided, they were a Boston company, and they had bought a Cytec Surgical Products out in California the year before us. And after about 1.5 years of total cultural clash, the Bostonians fired everybody out there. So as they say, I got fired after 15 months of just moving to California. It's like, was this an oh shirt moment? Really, this was really one of those things like, wow, best thing that ever happened to me, because I immediately started Focal Therapeutics. And so that's something that really lets me, both Proxima Therapeutics and Focal, really let me get a good idea about how this dilution stuff really impacts founders and early employees in the companies. And so I'll give you some pretty reality-based waterfall sort of results as we get to the end of the presentation. But Focal Therapeutics came about in 2007, and I realized I needed to get some co-founders with me with some more experience. And we launched that company right into the teeth of the 2008-2009 big recession. But, you know, we went ahead and did it, and you'll see in a minute what happened with that. I've also served as the chief science officer for Sienna Medical, which does medical devices in the breast surgical space. Most of my devices are in breast surgery, radiation oncology, and breast cancer and neuro-oncology. Now, I also started a company called Andari Therapeutics with a friend of mine from the Tiger program, Alex Zavorsky, and we were trying to go into a class 3 medical device for an implantable neurostimulator to compete with Medtronic. What we didn't know is that Allergan, which made Botox, was using Botox in the same indication that we were going into. We couldn't figure out why we couldn't get any traction. We couldn't get anybody to invest in Andari Therapeutics until we talked to a urologic surgeon in Charleston and paid him $1,000 for 2 hours of his time. And he told us, oh, you can do this overactive bladder. You can fix it with Botox injections, and it's done by any urologist in the office. And it's like, we left his office that night, drove back to Atlanta and said, okay, we're shutting the company down because we're hosed. It's a drug and it's reusable, and any urologist can use it. And so we ultimately shut down the company and walked on off to the next thing. It was interesting that Medtronic was doing $400 million in revenue off of their product called InterStim. Within 12 months, Botox was doing $200 million. So I think we made the right decision in that particular case. As Shauna mentioned, I did and still do play in the investing space. So Alex and I actually also started the life science vertical for Atlanta Technology Angels back in 2014. And from that, I went on the board of directors of the OB Medical Company, which was the first medical device company or healthcare company that ATA had ever invested in. This was a huge lesson learned activity for me, and that is the subject of another seminar or another discussion at some point, because it was one of the most painful professional things I've ever done in my life. Now, Proxima Therapeutics was acquired for $200 million back in 2005. Focal Therapeutics was acquired for $125 million in Q4 2018. Sienna was acquired 2 weeks later in 2018 for I think it's $175 million at the moment. And we did manage to sell OB Medical to Philips as well in September of 2018. So 2018 was an awesome year. As I'll show you in a late slide, it was 2018 and 2019 were awesome years for the medical device industry. All right, so that's enough about me and my path through and the roles that I did. This is just a few things about some of the devices that I did. You may be able to see my mouse. This is our first device from Proxima. It was a neuro-oncology product. It was very much like a radioactive drug, because the fluid in the vial up here was a radioactive fluid that we created it and designed it like a radioactive drug. It filled a balloon catheter that went into a resected brain tumor cavity, and it delivered radiation therapy from the inside of the tumor space to the outside. So it was a really, really gentle form of radiation therapy. We modified that to work in breast cancer so that we could get a 5-week, once-a-day radiation therapy treatment accomplished in just 5 days instead. And that's what got Proxima acquired for. But when I left Cytec Surgical Products and started Focal Therapeutics, we made something that it kind of arose, the idea for it arose from all the time I spent training breast surgeons and radiation oncologists on how to do accelerated partial breast irradiation. I heard so many complaints from the radiation oncologists that we need to be able to reduce the amount of volume we irradiate, and to do that we need a target, and we have a target for prostate cancer but not in breast. And then the breast surgeons complained about radiation therapy because there were such bad cosmetic outcomes with breast contracture and other really awful things that happen to women post-radiation therapy. So when I was getting bombarded from both sides with all these ideas, they all converged to one focal point, which is why we call it Focal Therapeutics. And we made this little bioabsorbable implant that looks kind of like a spring, and it has 6 titanium markers in it. And you can see this whole thing, all of the clear plastic will absorb within about 12 to 15 months. And it leaves these little markers in place right where the original tumor came out, so that in follow-up, the radiologist always knows where the original tumor was. And for the radiation oncologist, when he's doing radiation therapy, he can use that as a target to aim his radiation beams and get it to move much more quickly and with less collateral damage to normal tissue. Now, those are all from me being in operating roles. The last thing that I'll just mention is the 2 different companies that I'm on the board of now. I'm not doing anything operational with them. I'm just, you know, an investor as well as a board member. The first one is Micro C Imaging, and this is a radiology company. So it's a handheld digital X-ray device that's used by orthopedic surgeons, and that's in the top image. And then Restore 3D, which does custom 3D printed metal and polymer body part replacements. And both of those companies have raised money recently. And one of them's got multiple FDA clearances, and one of them is still working on their first one. So that's a little bit about me to let you know where I'm coming from. But I want to give you a couple of caveats. You know, I have started and managed a lot of different medical device companies, something like 5 or so at this point. I've turned around one of them, OB Medical Company, so I had some experience doing that. But since I wasn't sure if this was going to be all health tech or healthcare related audience members today, I just wanted to let you know that my experience is it's limited to healthcare. And that's, in fact, the biggest deal of starting a company in this space compared to virtually any other space is that we have FDA regulation, and at least in 2 of my products, we had Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulation on top of that. So it was a lot of interesting challenges, but we have all the same challenges that any other startup has. We have to have adequate market size to gain interest of strategic acquirers. You have to demonstrate product market fit, that you're solving a real problem out there. You got to understand how can you get to the right pricing, and this means you have to understand reimbursement. You need significant experience with sales channels, whether it's distributors, you're going direct, it's a hybrid model or whatever, and also how do you raise money and how do you manage cash and expenses. So the couple of things that I've learned over this is when you're successful in med devices, doing a startup, it's long timelines. Like my shortest one was 8 years. That was Proxima Therapeutics. Focal Therapeutics, we started in 2007, sold it in 2018. That's 11 years for a class 2 medical device. Now, on the other hand, the one thing I've learned in my career is that if you see you're heading down the failure loop, go ahead and kill it quickly. This is really important because you don't want to waste your time, your effort, or anybody's money in what's going to be a failure. And you probably will get a pretty good idea that you have insurmountable problems pretty quickly. You know, a 4-year failure where you've raised $10 million in investor money is really difficult to deal with. So I'm not really familiar with rapid and easy fundraising nor sales. I've done all my sales with the direct sales model where we built multiple sales forces that were all what we call W-2 people. They were our employees. That's one way that I think is I've been successful with that. The distributors, not so much. Never done an IPO. It's all of my liquidity events have been acquisitions by public companies only. So the last thing to keep in mind, because I've heard Professor Raines refer to me on multiple occasions as a Debbie Downer because I do have a lot of cautionary things to talk about, but I'm going to tell you right up front, don't walk away from this thinking that this is difficult and you can't do it. I loved my time as an entrepreneur. And it was one of the most satisfying things to me to bring new products to market that solve real clinical problems, that either saved lives, reduced morbidity. It just really helped patients out. I hated fundraising, but this is because I'm a trained extrovert. Fundraising is an unnatural activity to me, but for people who are extroverted naturally, fundraising can be a lot of fun because you're always meeting new people and you're giving them ideas and you're getting feedback from them. So just bear that in mind, that some aspects of this is going to be tough. Now, the other thing I would offer up to you as entrepreneurs is always ask other entrepreneurs for advice. I used to think that no entrepreneur would ever want to give away the secret sauce of what they did to be successful or how to avoid mistakes they made. This is totally not true. Entrepreneurs really love to help them, their ecosystem out. Yeah, even if you're in a closely but not totally competitive area, you ask, you're going to get tons of advice, and take advantage of it so that you can make your own unique mistakes and not some that somebody else is more than happy to tell you about. And the last thing I just want to tell you about that is, entrepreneurs, you create all the value in the world. This is really important to remember. The folks who don't like to do entrepreneurship, don't like to take risks, they want to work for the big companies, they're not creating near the kind of value that you will. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned along the route, and a lot of this is based on mistakes. And when you see some of the things that I post up here in bullet points in yellow, those are recommendations, not just facts or impressions. That's things that I've realized makes a lot of sense to go after. So with that, I'll stop right here and see if anybody's got any questions so far.
Nothing in the Q&A chat so far, but if you guys have questions, please be sure to plop them in there.
Yeah, hopefully we still have some people there.
Oh, we got a good number.
All right, so we're going to talk real quickly about corporate structures, and we're going to dive into the only one that matters a little bit. LLCs, limited liability corporations. A lot of you are going to get started this way because it's easy, it's cheap, and it's just an easy thing to do. You can do it, you can start these things online, but you are only going to use that corporate structure before you go raise any investor cash. Once you do that, no investor will ever put money into an LLC. You're going to have to change that. The other corporate structure you're not going to use is an S-Corp. You can't, and the venture capitalists will not put money into S-Corps or LLCs. The S-Corp is great for something that's going to be a lifestyle business. You're going to run it for the rest of your life. That's great. That's what it's there for. So instead, it's the C-Corp, the standard, corporation. And this is required by any investor if you're going to raise investor cash. And the other thing you're going to find out is they're going to require you to do it as a Delaware C-Corp. The other thing I would just mention about investors is if you're going to raise money from investors, you have to expect to get them paid back multiples on what they put in. You can't expect to take money from them and can treat it like a loan that you're going to pay back with interest. That's not the definition of an investor. They want to make multiples on their investment, and they're willing to take the risk that they're probably going to lose it all, more than likely. So you'll need to do everything you can to try to make them a return, which will also make you a return, which is actually quite a fun thing to have happen. All right, so let's look at some of the pros and cons on C-Corps. So you can have an unlimited number and type of shareholders, and this has investor implications because when you start a C-Corp, you're going to have common stock. That goes to your founders, that goes to your employees, but when you bring in outside investor cash, they're going to get preferred shares, because there's a lot of things that preferred shares, a lot of privileges and a lot of restrictions that they have and preferences, and we'll talk about some of that in just a little bit. So you'll have common and preferred share classes. You can use restricted stock, you can use stock options, and you can use warrants. These are all ways that you'll oftentimes do equity-based compensation for the people that you're bringing on board as either employees, consultants, or contractors. Now, there's a thing called QSB, which is a qualified small business, and there's really some nice tax incentives on that. You can get a total exclusion of any capital gain on stock that's held for 5+ years. So for example, when we sold Proximate Therapeutics in 2005, this law didn't exist. But when we sold Focal Therapeutics and those other companies in 2018, it did exist. And if your founder shares, I had them from day one, all those things, I had no capital gains tax in the state or at the federal level for those. Let me tell you, it's really nice when you don't have to pony up 23.8% to the feds on long-term capital gain, and another 6% if you live here in Georgia on it. When I lived in California, it would have been 13.3% plus the 24% federal. Almost lose half of it just for taxes. So this is really big. It's a huge implication for you founders. VC funds won't invest in those pass-through corps that I mentioned before, LLCs and S-Corps. So the Delaware C-Corp is the most common type. But one thing, if you haven't seen it before and you do a Delaware C-Corp, be careful when you get your first tax bill from Delaware. They'll send it to you, and you might owe, according to them, a huge amount of money. Like when I started Focal Therapeutics, I put that in as a Delaware C-Corp. 6 months later, they hit me with my first estimated tax payment that I needed to do, and it was $185,000, and I hadn't raised the first dollar for that company yet. I'm like, what the hell? And it turns out that it's all based on the fact that I had 6 million shares in the company issued, and they base their tax rate, number one, on the total number of shares. And number two, they'll base it on the revenue that you generate and the profit that you earn. So my CPA had to go through it and go, oh, no, you don't have to worry about that. You didn't make any money. There was no earnings, so you only owed like $150. So I was like, wow, that was an oh shirt moment, big time. Until we got that squared away. There really are no disadvantages of any importance really that matter at all on this. So C-Corp's the way to go. You're gonna do it a Delaware C-Corp. If you're a Georgia C-Corp, that's probably fine. If you haven't picked up venture investors yet, they will probably want you or require you to change over to a Delaware C-Corp.
Hey, James, we have a question.
Sure.
So is being a qualified small business the same as when you file your 83B election after you're issued stock? And maybe we can define what an 83B is as well for the attendees.
I'm gonna botch the 83B because I'm not a CPA, but an 83B election allows you essentially file with IRS that you received stock of essentially zero value or some specified value. And when I put it in, it was like, I got like 6 million shares for $6. That was founder shares. And you file that, and that allows you to then establish your basis. And it means that when you go to file your personal income taxes the next year, you show zero income based on that stock that got issued to you. So that's all that is. But what the 83B election does is it starts the clock on the qualified small business. So the qualified small business, there's a number of criteria, but the number one thing is it has to be a business that has been incorporated and you've owned stock for 5 years. The second thing is they have limits on the amount of, I think it's either revenue or earnings. And for medical device startups, unless you are a real unicorn and you're into generating revenue and your cash flow break even really crazy fast, like 3 years or so, you don't have to worry about it. You'll be a qualified small business by the time you get liquid on your successful startup. So if that didn't answer your question, go ahead and hit the chat box for Shauna, and we'll come back and hit it maybe at the end or next.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So cash for your venture. We'll talk a little bit about this. In previous talks, I spent a lot more time talking about the things in medtech that burn your cash and how to set up your value-added milestones so that you know how to plan out your fundraising. But I'm not going to go into that level of detail today. But the cash requirements are certainly going to vary depending on what stage of the venture you're at. If you're just in the proof of principle, then you're probably looking at small amounts of money. By small amounts of money, I mean $500,000 to $1 million or so. And you're just trying to achieve a working prototype and put it through some sort of benchtop testing. That's what a proof of principle thing would be. It'll also depend on your regulatory and clinical requirements. So if you're a class 1, class 2, or a class 3 device, the amount of money it takes to bring those products to market is vastly different. Class 1 you could probably do for 6 figures. A class 3 device is going to be 9 figures. You're going to need 150 million or more because the clinical studies are so voluminous on PMAs to do that. So that also dictates, clinical trial size. Most class 2 devices don't require clinical trial unless you're de novo. Then you're going to have to do one. If you're in the PMA land or class 3, you're going to do probably a first-in-man, which is a small one. You're going to do a safety and performance. Then you're going to do your pivotal study, which is going to run you years to do and tens of millions of dollars just to pay for the clinical study itself. Then the amount of money you raise is going to depend pretty significantly once you've got your clearances on how you're going to launch your product. And by this, I mean, what's your sales channel? If you're going to do a direct sales force, hire your own people, that's expensive. And it may mean you have to raise between 7 and maybe 20 million to do that. At Focal Therapeutics, we raised a total of I guess it was $14 million, and we did our own direct sales force, and most of the money, probably all of it, about 5 million, was spent just on them. With Proximate Therapeutics, we raised 2 different sales forces. We raised $51 million, and when we got acquired, we had 8 million in the bank, and we spent probably, out of that 43 million, my best guess is we probably spent 35 of it on the sales organization and cost of sales and cost of goods and things like that. Going through distributors is a different animal. You can utilize them. It's not nearly as expensive because you're not adding the head count, but you're going to be doing transfer pricing. So instead of you pulling in at top line 100% of the revenue that's generated due to your sales, you're only going to be able to book probably 40, 50% of it. The rest of that goes over to the distributors. And you don't have control over their actions and what do they put at the top of their priority list when they're selling. That's a huge, to me, con against distributors is that you don't have control over them. If it's your sales force, you've got control over their incentive package totally. That's, to me, a really, really good thing. I love writing commission checks. I don't like writing checks to, you know, for other things, but commission checks are great because that means you made a boatload more revenue than the commission checks that you just paid out. The other thing that you may run into, particularly if you're doing a class 3 device, is getting big companies as your strategic partners. And by those, I mean the Boston Scientifics, the Medtronics, the Hologics, those that already have a sales force in place, and you're just partnering with them, and they become the de facto distributor, but they also become the de facto #1 candidate to acquire you, which is both good and bad. It's good because they're the #1 candidate to acquire you. They know the business real well. That can move pretty quickly. But the bad part about it is if they already have control over your revenue stream, it's really hard to set up that auction environment to try to get 2 to 3 players to bid up the price of your venture because they're all competing with each other to see who can take your product and put it in their company. So now just moving, there's in general, there's really just 2 types of financing. You can have non-dilutive financing. I'll hit that in just a second. You can have equity financing. So I'm going to move through non-dilutive, and then we'll stop and ask a couple of questions, have any questions that pop up. So I think we just need to move through this slide. So for non-dilutive, you know, this is where you're getting money from foundations, friends, and family. You may also have, you know, different state level types of grants, like from the Georgia Research Alliance. And then there's the federal type of grants. You can get the Small Business Innovative Research and the Small Business Technology Transfer Research grants. All of those are great because you take cash into the business to do product development, or to, if you get phase 2 on the SBIR grants, that's also to do, you know, to work on your sales channel, distribution, and things like that can be paid for out of that, in addition to maybe your big clinical studies. But those, you don't give up any ownership. That's what it means by non-dilutive. It's, you know, that's, I won't call it free money, but it's money that comes in and you don't give up equity for it. So there, you know, we can talk about this. It'd be a seminar unto itself, or you can go contact someone over at ATDC, the Advanced Technology Development Center in Tech Square. They have somebody who specializes in SBIR, STTR grants, finding the right program, and also writing those grants up. So I'd encourage you to go see Connie Castile over there. And I think she may have changed her name in the last couple of years, but Connie is the person who does that for us. So with that, Shauna, do we have any questions we want to hit real quick?
We do. Some folks were looking to get some clarification on, let's say they've already formed the LLC. When should they think about converting to a C-Corp?
Well, if you, since it's really not expensive, you're not going to spend much money. Maybe, you know, if you pay a lawyer to file a C-Corp documents and put together some of the other, you know, early documents, you know, it may cost you a few $1,000s to do it, but you're going to have to do it before you take any investor cash. And by that, I mean venture capital. You can take convertible notes and things, debt instruments. You can do that all day long as an LLC. But when those things convert, they're going to be, your investor in the convertible notes are almost assuredly not going to want common stock. They're going to want preferred stock with the preferences and other advantages that come with it. That means you have to have the C-Corp in place in order to do the conversion of convertible notes or safe notes. You'll have to have it before you can do that qualified financing. So hopefully that answer, you can go as long as you can, but you're going to hit a point as soon as you go to take professional investor money, you're going to have, you'll have to change your LLC over to a C-Corp. The earlier you do it, the less issues you have with valuation of the enterprise and all of the tax and other ramifications that go with that. So personally, I would probably just, when I did my startups, I just started them as Delaware C-Corps. If you have an LLC now, if you really think you're going to be successful and you're really going to go at it hard, go ahead and go all in. Get your C-Corp, get it changed over right now, and just move forward like that. Now, I think Shauna just dropped off. Christina, do you see any other questions?
Yes, there are several other questions. So one from the Q&A box is, as a new entrepreneur, what tips would you give to creating a robust team of experts? And would you recommend to work towards what the stakeholders would likely fund, or what would solve the problem?
Well, if you're going to be, we'll try to answer those quickly because it's not a real topic for today, but in setting up your board of advisors, you really kind of need two broad categories of advisors. The first one is you want to have clinical or technical advisors. So you go, to the extent you can, get the thought leaders or key opinion leaders, KOLs, in the space and get them on board and see if you can, at the very least, use their name and the fact that other people that are either going to be future physician customers or people buying your product or using your product, they'll recognize their name. So, but then you need to at least one or two of these people that are local, you can take your stuff to them, put it in their hands, and have them give you honest, straight up feedback. So those people are probably not going to be KOLs, simply because KOLs are going to be real busy and they're going to be consultants to multiple different companies. So if you do go after a KOL or any other clinician type of advisor, make sure they don't have a conflict of interest, meaning that they work for a competitor or somebody you perceive to be a competitor for you. So that's one thing to watch out for with them. On the other side is you're going to need some business type advisors, people who've been through this before, entrepreneurs who've raised money, have taken a business, a startup, particularly in our space, and moved it from the idea on the back of a napkin, raised money and taken it all the way to hopefully a liquidity event, or at least through building a sales force or getting into sales, because those are really different animals. At the early stage when you're doing product development, the company has a totally different feel than it does when you go commercial. You'll go from the engineering sort of personality that the company would have in the early days, and when you start hiring salespeople, whoa, they're so extroverted, it really changes the tenor of the entire company. It's an amazing thing to watch. And I hope you all get the chance to do that.
So we have one more quick question on the non-dilutive funding front. How do you treat non-dilutive funding on your financial statements?
It's going to come in as revenue, and you don't worry about it, because you're going to be, most of the grants that come in, they typically will either pay you in tranches, or as you're just about to start executing something, you're going to have built up enough net operating losses because you're not bringing in revenue and all you're doing is spending money. You don't have to worry about paying tax. So if that's the question, and I know that's what a lot of entrepreneurs are worried about. You bring in all of this money, you don't worry about paying tax on it. So okay. That should be pretty straightforward.
Sounds good. Let's move on to convertible notes.
All right, so convertible notes, and we're going to move through this real quick. These are debt instruments. Most of you probably already looked at some of these. Some of you maybe have used convertible notes and safe notes, which are a version of convertible notes. So you'll typically see that the interest rate that you're going to pay or is going to accrue on that's the 8 to 10% range. I wouldn't worry about trying to jawbone somebody down to like 4% or 6%. You're only going to be accruing interest for hopefully a small amount of time. And so we look at the cap and term, and these two numbers I'm just making up. 4 million is a cap. It may be lower than that. If you've never raised any money and this is your first convertible notes, your cap, a smart angel investor would say, well, I want a cap of like 2 million, because you're arguing for a pre-money value of like 5 or 6 million, which is probably pretty rich. But the cap really, it protects the investor and it maximizes their return because it limits the amount of value that this company has in determining how many shares they actually get. So the cap and the term are going to be somewhat dependent upon where you are in the life cycle of your company. Then there's going to be the last thing is the discount on the conversion to equity. 10 to 20% is typical. That's okay. But most of the time, if the cap gets invoked, and this is one of the things to watch out for, if you do a qualified financing, and you've got angel investors with convertible notes, make sure, if possible, you're not obligated to give them both the cap and the discount, because if they're getting the cap, by definition, they're already getting a discount. So you don't want to give them both. Maybe I should have made that one yellow. So when payments made, principal and interest, it can be paid back to those investors, but that's really rare because nobody who gives you money on a convertible note is interested in making interest. They're not, dividend type investors. They want to make a capital gain, and the only way to do that is not to get paid back, is to get equity in the company. So paying it back is rare. The other part is new investors are going to get really upset with you if you take $1 million of the, say, the $4 million you just brought into the company in Series A. If you suddenly give $1 million of that away to original convertible note investors, they're going to be really unhappy with you. And you're going to be unhappy with yourself because you need all of that cash for operating activities. So cash is king. You really want to keep and squeeze it and keep your burn as low as you can. The principal and interest will convert to whatever type of stock is involved in the next financing, which is the qualified financing. And that's usually going to be a preferred series of shares, usually Series A, but sometimes it could be Series B if you do a little bridge round or something between A and the close of Series B. So let's just give you a real quick example of how this impacts your your financial statement. So let's say you have an angel who gives you a convertible note and it converts at your Series A. And let's say the angel groups have put in $1 million. Well, just before conversion, you're going to have $1 million in either short-term or long-term debt. That's what's going to be on your balance sheet. As soon as you do the Series A, you're going to have that capital infusion, and then those angels are going to have their debt instrument wiped out. So all of that debt that was either long-term or short-term obligations, it goes away. It's zeroed out. On your balance sheet, you now have a Series A preferred stock line in addition to your common stock line, and all of a sudden that has a lot of shareholders, including the angel investor who's showing up there. So the debt gets wiped out, and now it has an impact on your cap table or capitalization table. And we'll talk a little bit about the ramifications on cap tables towards the end of this. So you can consider a convertible note as non-dilutive, but only until it's converted. And once it's converted, now it becomes equity and it drops off. And at that point, by definition, it's dilutive. All right, so in general, you've probably heard an awful lot about the different rounds of financing, and we'll get started. The seed round, that's any of the type of money you're raising early on before you do the professional or the institutional investor rounds. This is friends, family, and they call it fools. Anybody who would, essentially give you money early on, and that includes angel investors. Now, once you've moved through like proof of principle and so forth, you then do your first institutional round. That's when you get a real venture capitalist on board. That's called your Series A. Then you have your Series B as you raise more money to achieve more of your value-added milestones. Maybe it's new clinical trials or something like that. And this just goes on and on until you get to your liquidity event. So like at Proximate Therapeutics, we raised 5 rounds. We did Series A, B, C, D, E. At Focal Therapeutics, we only went up to Series D. So you keep doing these, these preferred rounds of stock. Each of them different. They have different preferences. They may have different governance requirements in it, and they'll all are going to add at least one new board member to your company. All this goes on until you hit your liquidity event, which today, and this has been true for about probably 10 years, you're either going to get acquired or the company's going to get dissolved. The third option, IPO, doesn't happen anymore. You just don't see IPOs, initial public offerings, in the medical device space anymore. You do see it in biologics and drugs. That happens all the time because they have to raise so much money. They have to go to the public markets to do that and to get their original investors the return that they need. So since you're really your only two outcomes are you either get the company acquired, in which case all of your investors get some kind of return on their investment, or the company gets dissolved, in which case nobody gets anything. You're in it to win it. And that's the way you have to look at it as soon as you take investor cash. You're not going to be a lifestyle business once you take investors on. Anybody got any questions so far?
We have a question about, and I think you might be getting to it, how much equity you typically offer in seed round, Series A, and the like, but I think we might get there.
I think we'll probably hit some amount of it. The short answer to that question is, I have no idea. It's really going to depend on how much money you need to raise at the seed round to accomplish enough things to essentially, and by accomplishing things, I mean, how much risk can you eliminate for your business proposition, your medical device, or your product idea? It's all about reducing risk. And that's going to govern how long does it take for you to achieve, say, a proof of principle thing. If it takes 3 months, that's maybe a fairly short amount of money, small amount of money, because you don't have a lot of headcount, you don't have a lot of cash burn. But if it's not, if you have a long time to get to like a cadaver study, just to show that your device idea actually works in a realistic model, that may take $1 million, and that's just, those are, raising $250,000 and $1,000 and raising $1 million. They're different animals. They take different amount of time.
Great. And now that we're moving into equity financing, in your talk track, if you could, when you talk about VCs, just address how often they want you to recapitalize the company. There's another question about that, but we can get to that in your talk track.
That one's pretty easy. They want you to recapitalize it before you run out of frickin' money from their round. Because once they're on board, they're largely in the same boat with you founders, except that they've got preferences that you don't. So they're largely wanting to pull your boat in the same direction you are. So as you start to get down to like 12 months of cash in the bank, because those venture guys are going to be on your board. They're going to tell you, all right, you got to start fundraising now, because if you're doing your fundraising, venture rounds take at least 6 months. You should budget 6 to 9 months. That means you can't start it when you've got 3 months of cash left. If you do, you're going to be out of money. And as soon as one of these prospective investors starts due diligence and they look at your financials and go, oh, you're going to be out of money in 6 weeks. You know what? I'll talk to you in about another 5 weeks, and we'll start our negotiations then, in which case you're over a barrel and you're largely screwed. So that's why the existing investors are going to push you real hard to start the fundraising well in advance of you running out of cash or even getting into vapors. That way you take away at least one of those really significant negotiating levers that the future investors are going to be trying to press against you as you move forward. And this is really important today. In 2019, fundraising was a lot easier than it is today. I'm sad to say. All right. Hopefully that kind of got to the question, but let's take a look at some of the equity financing. So angel funding is very, very early, and it's what I consider to be small amounts, $250K up to $5 million. Now, some of you may have heard that the classic angel investor, might put up $50,000. Yeah, some of them will do that. $50,000 doesn't do anything to help you out, frankly. You need multiple people to come in and pool that kind of money together to get a reasonable amount of money to actually be able to concentrate on product development for a short period of time and not be constantly fundraising. Fundraising for your CEO is very tiring, and it is very stressful, and it is very distracting. You can't really think about hardly anything else. So you want to raise really more money than you think you need so that you actually can take a breather and concentrate on actually running the business for a while longer. Now, angels, when you can get them to pool their investments together, like say Atlanta Technology Angels, or you can get them to syndicate deals, and we'll chat about that in a minute. You can see that, like when we did OB Medical, we did all of that, we raised, I think, $7 million, and we did that all from angels and individuals. So you can actually get a pretty significant amount of money from angel groups at this point in time. You can also do crowdsourcing, but for medical devices and healthcare stuff, that's BS. It just doesn't work for us. And that's because you can't build a little prototype and give it to them in exchange for $50 or $1,000. You don't want $1,000 investors because your cap table gets really messy, really bad, really fast. Now, most of the funding that you're going to get is going to be from the venture capital industry. And this is, again, this will be all your preferred series of rounds that you start moving through after proof of principle. You'll keep doing that until you have your liquidity event. The round size is highly variable, and it gets bigger on almost every single round. And I'll give you an example. I don't remember if I've still got the slide on what our different rounds were for Proximate Therapeutics, but we did like 2.5 million, then 5 million, then I think it was about 12 or 14 million, and another 20 million. I mean, they just got bigger and bigger because we needed much larger chunks of cash to do things like creating the sales force and really trying to blow out the marketing channels. But venture it's almost impossible to get a venture capitalist to put money into your company with less than about probably $8 million. And this is a topic for another conversation, which is the venture industry and how do you get it. But if you look at the size of a venture capitalist fund, if it's a $200 million fund that they raised, in 5 years, the first 5 years of that fund, they got to put half of that to work, and they don't like doing more than about 10 investments because it gets hard to manage and be on the boards of more than 10 different companies. So if you take 100 million and divide it by 10, you can see you're already at a $10 million minimum investment, and they're keeping the other half of that 100 million or 10 million per investment. That's for additional rounds that you're going to have to do. So it's really hard to find a small venture, to be able to get a small chunk of money from a venture capitalist. You need 50 million, not a problem. You need 2 million. That can be very hard to find that from a venture guy. That's why the angels have really kind of stepped into that spot in the last 5 years. All right, so let's look at a little bit more. A lot of you probably have heard about pre-money valuation, and maybe some of you don't know how this works. In a couple of slides, I'm going to give you a recommendation for a great book that explains all about venture financing, all the terminology and what's important and what's not important. But pre-money valuation, that's just how much is your company worth right now before you take investor cash into it. So the math on this is pretty easy, but the basis for it is like kind of fictional. So this is what you think your ventures is worth. So if you're raising a Series A, you might go up and say, okay, we think our pre-money value is like $5 million. Well, the investor's gonna go, I don't think so. I think it's maybe 3. And you argue it out and you come to some amount, and that's what the investment's made on. So I'll give you an example. And this one's kind of ridiculous, but it's because an $8 million pre-money value that you're going to angels with, that's a little out of whack. But it makes the math really easy. Let's say you've got an $8 million pre-money value. That's what you think it's worth, and that's what the investor who's coming in thinks it's worth. They put in $2 million. You've got a pre-money of $8 million. Your post-money value is $10 million. It's just 8 plus 2. And the angel now owns 20% of your company. That's dilution on you. You just took a 20% dilution hit by bringing that angel on board. Now, usually angel investors, they're going to be investing in the convertible notes or safe notes, and those things don't have a lot of governance types of requirements in it, but oftentimes they will have preferences in it. All your venture rounds, all your series preferred will have preferences. Preferences, liquidation preference, that just means that if your company gets bought, the preferred shareholder classes, they get their preference, they get the first slice of money before anything ever goes down. So the Series B people will be paid their preference, which might be 100% of their, of what they put in. So they put in $10 million. The first, if you sold the company for 30 million, the first 10 million go straight to Series B. Then 20 million would then go to Series A. And after they're paid, whatever's left gets distributed to the common shareholders. Now, so you can see a liquidation preferences, and we saw in like 2014 through 2019, liquidation preferences was 1x. So whatever they put in, they're going to get that back before anybody gets another dollar. But what you would hope to do is there's so much, you were so successful that so much money came in that you could pay all the preferences all the way down to the common stock and still have money left over. So you would do what everybody would convert to common and everybody would get a pro rata share. That's like a huge win. That happened at Proxima Therapeutics, that happened at Focal Therapeutics. Did not happen at Sienna Medical. The Series E, D, and C, they got 100% of the preference and everybody else took a bit of a haircut. There's this thing called participating preferred, which by gosh, you want to avoid this. So in this situation, the preferred shareholders, not only do they get their liquidation preference, but the money that's left over after they get paid, they convert into common stock along with everybody else, and then they get to participate again. And this is really hateful. It's just a terrible thing for the entrepreneurs and the founders. So to the extent you can, you want to do in your preferred rounds, you want them to be non-participating preferred. So the VCs, the Series A, B, C, D, whatever, they get to decide, do they make more money just getting their preference, or do they get more money by having everybody convert to common and taking the pro rata share based on the fully diluted number of shares they would get at conversion? That's what you want to do, because that's the most founder friendly. With that, let me just pause for a second and see if there's any questions on that.
Nothing specific on those topics, but we are touching a little bit on valuation and value inflection points. So why don't we hop in and address how often and when do we set value for stocks, or how do we think about dilution in the context of valuation?
Okay, well, valuation is really tough because valuation is a totally negotiated amount. And you might think your venture's worth $30 million based on where you are right now. With medical devices, it's, from a practical perspective, it's impossible to have a $30 million pre-money valuation if you're not generating revenue. It's just not possible. I mean, even if you've raised $30 million, it's hard to justify it. So valuation is one of those creepy little things that there's three different formulas or methodologies to doing it. And the one that's used most often is the venture capital method. And that's really where a venture capitalist comes in. And because they're so professional and they do this all the time, they're supposed to be able to value your enterprise based on your market size of the market opportunity your products or your business is going after, how profitable they think you could be once you hit, cash flow break even, and how much growth potential you've got. But it's really, at the end of the day, it all becomes based on, to a certain extent, how much money you've raised in the past and how much return do they think they can actually get out of you. And most Series A investors are walking into that with an expectation they're going to have a 10x return on their investment. So if they put in $1 million, their expectation is, I'm going to make 10 million, when this thing goes liquid. That's, most of the time, that's just totally not true. It doesn't happen. But that's kind of the expectations. Angels, since they go in earlier when there's more risk, but less value to the company, they're expecting like a 20x return on their money. I don't think I can really give you a good answer for how do you value your enterprise. You need to kind of take a look at either what other companies are at your stage in your segment of the industry, and what's their pre or post money value from the last round that they did. Some of this information you can find from
Crunchbase is a great resource.
Crunchbase, yeah. The thing you have to be aware of on Crunchbase is the numbers that they give you for the amount of capital that was raised. That's like the floor. They miss a lot sometimes. So just be careful. You can also look you can search on Edgar.com anytime a company, even if it's, if it's privately held, if they want to raise money from investors, even like venture people, not public markets, not going public, but just from venture people, they have to file a specific form with the Securities and Exchange Commission. You can look at those things and it will tell you how much they're trying to raise. And sometimes you will actually see some indication on there of what they think their value is. So there are some places you can see it, but determining valuation is a negotiated thing. One thing to watch out for is if you take a convertible note and you put a $2 million cap on it, a lot of venture guys will go in and say, well, $2 million cap, we'll call that your pre-money value. And you have to really argue hard with why that's not right. They know it's not right, but they'll use that as a negotiating ploy. But you would never want your pre-money value to be less than your cap. Okay, let's see. Did I hit that question, Shauna? All right, so I will, woo, you can see not participating for, that's the happy place. You'll do your happy dance there. All right, so let's hit a little bit more about angel equity financing. These are generally speaking wealthy people or family offices or other investors that will come in before you have venture capital. Again, it's small amounts, maybe upwards of 5 million. They expect to get anywhere from 15% to about a third of your company in return for their investment. But they're not, by doing a convertible note, they're not putting a value specifically on the company. They're not pricing any of the shares. They're just kicking that can down the road for the qualified financing, the Series A. They will oftentimes, if they put in enough money, want to get a board of directors position. Try to limit them to observer status. Most angels are not going to have operating experience in your industry that's going to bring any benefit to your management team or your CEO. So try to just get observer status if you can at all do that. Always remember that the timeline for healthcare products is very, very long. So as early investors, they're going to have to expect to wait 8 to 12 years before they get a return on their investment. And because angels are not good at pricing, doing the valuation of the company, they don't lead rounds. So don't ask them to. And that's why they use convertible notes that don't specify what the share price is. So now one thing you can do is you can have the angels, like if you're going to have to probably, if you're going to raise a significant amount of money, $1 million, $1.5 million, you're going to have to go to multiple angel groups to get that. See if you can get them to syndicate that. And that makes it a lot easier for them to spread their risk and things like that. It's actually a fairly smart thing to do. Now, one of the things that I want to make a couple of side notes here on angel equity financing. I mean, oftentimes they don't pool their members' investments. Like if you go to ATA and you pitch to them and you get 9 members who are interested in investing, unless you tell them to start an LLC, pool all the individual investor money into that LLC, and then give you one check. And that gives you just one investor on your cap table instead of 9, they won't do it. And you can go in and say, okay, we're going to put a minimum investment of like $25,000 because believe it or not, you will get a lot of these ATA members who will put in $2,500 bucks. Oh my God, you don't want to have, if you're raising $250,000, you don't want 100 individual investors who only put in $2,500 on your cap table. That makes it a nightmare to try to go and get shareholder votes and things of that nature done. So whenever possible, require the LLC, the investor group to put all of their investors into an LLC. Even at ATA, they'll pool a whole bunch of them, but there's a few of them who put in like a significant chunk, like $100,000 that say, I'm not going into LLC, I'm going straight on the cap table. There's not a lot of real reason for that other than they just want to be on the cap table. Makes them feel good. But for $100,000, I'd put an individual on the cap table. That wouldn't be a problem. Even at 25K, I'd probably do it. The next thing to remember, when you do get, if you end up with a board of director member from an angel group, one of the things you're going to want to do, and I think I mentioned this a little bit later, is you want to make sure it's in writing at the time they come on the board when they exit the board, you know, sunset them. And you're going to want to sunset them as soon as you realistically can, because they're not going to bring you any operating experience. They're not going to bring you any extra value. When you put on board members and you bring investors, it's better to bring in smart money, experienced money, or thick Rolodex money. Those are people who not only bring you cash, but they bring something else to the party that's going to help you out in the long run. If it's just cash, they may just have a person, you know, if you put them on the board and they've got an obstreperous personality, it may just generate conflict all over the place. And then you got to manage that too. In terms of them, once you come to the main terms of it, you know, the cap, the term, the interest rate, and the discount, instead of having them draft up a term sheet, give them yours. That way you can specify on the first round what all your governance issues and preferences and stuff like that. You govern that. You make the first suggestion. Most of the time, they've never seen this before, and they'll be more than happy to let you run with that. So make their job easier. Give them a term sheet once you do the main economic terms together. All right, so let's move over to venture capital. And you know, the venture side of things, of course, it all starts after the seed round, and multiple rounds are the norm. And usually Series A in medical devices is going to get you through the early stages, the prototypes, preclinical studies. It's going to get you maybe halfway through pulling together your 510K. It maybe even get you a little bit farther. Oftentimes you need to get your Series B to finish the 510K, to do any first-in-man clinical studies, and possibly safety and performance. Now, first-in-man is like a 10-patient study. Safety and performance should be 20, 25, no more than that, because you're not determining effectiveness. It's just, does it work like you said it would work? And is it safe? Do you understand the adverse events associated with its use? So if you're having to do a Series C, that's usually for like a Class 2 device, that's targeting your commercialization. So that's how you set the size of your Series C. How much money do you need to raise to either build a sales force and get traction, or if you're, say, a Class 3 device, how much money do you need to raise to move through your halfway point of accrual in a pivotal trial? You know, maybe that's 500 out of your 1,000 patients. At that point, you could do a data analysis, show that you're meeting your primary and secondary endpoints in an interim analysis, and that gives you the kind of data that makes it pretty easy to go raise your Series D for finishing that PMA process. Series D for like a Class 2 device, that's really going to be sales expansion, going from 3 or 4 sales reps with, you know, 3 or 4 territories to 16 sales reps, and now you're totally covering the country, and maybe starting to think about some international distributors or something of that nature. Now, one thing to bear in mind, I don't know how many of you have ever heard the term down rounds. A down round is where your Series C share price is lower than your Series B share price. This is not a good thing, because it will kick in all sorts of triggers that may be around for anti-dilution, such as ratchets and half ratchets, which would be some of the terms that are inside of your investor rights agreements and stock purchase agreements and things like that that you have to negotiate with all of your preferred series shareholders. So you want to avoid that if your business can do that. In Proxima Therapeutics, we never did a down round. We did one flat round, all the rest of them went up. Focal, we did one flat round, all the rest went up. Sienna Medical did a huge down round, and they actually had to do a reverse, like 17-to-1 stock split in order to not have, you know, 100 million shares outstanding. And it's like, you know, a lot of my Series A shares got just whacked. when that happened. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. The last thing I just want to mention on this is this is my go-to book on venture financing, and it explains everything in it. It gives examples of term sheets. It describes how to do post-money, pre-money calculations, fully diluted calculations. Anything that you're going to run into in negotiating a financing, that book talks about it. It goes over the governance terms, and it even tells you some of the things that are worth negotiating over and some of the things that you can just no, don't care, just throw it away. So this is really a great book for everybody to pick up, and it's an easy read too. All right, so before I'm gonna kind of close out now with what happens to your founder stock with dilution example. Does anybody have any questions at this point they want to hit?
So we do have one question about how do you maximize your probability of success in raising those early rounds, your seed and Series A?
Wow, that's a multifactorial question. Probably, well, here's what almost every venture capitalist I've talked to over the last 25 years has told me that, and some of you have probably heard variants on this. They're investing in the team, not in the product. Because what they'll also tell you is if you have a mediocre product, but an awesome market and it fits it really well, it's going to win. It's going to get adopted and the business is going to be successful. If you have the greatest product in the world, but the market's either real tiny, nobody will touch it, or the market's crap, and it's hard to penetrate, there's billions of competitors, you just won't get traction. So what the investors are betting on is the people that are in the management team have been through it before, or they have a pretty significant advisory team around them that's been through it before and can offer to backstop them with a lot of great advice and a lot of experience-based suggestions and advice and things like that. What will oftentimes happen, and I've been fortunate with Proxima, I saw this, that our founding CEO, he stayed with the company from founding, product development, regulatory approvals on 2 product lines, built 2 sales forces, got the thing out to cash flow break even, all the way to acquisition. That's rare for one person to run the company from inception all the way to liquidity event. There's not a lot of Bill Gateses and Zuckerbergs out there. Most people are really good at the technical part of it, product development, but the sales thing, it's almost like a mindset or a psychology difference. And it's kind of like I told you about the corporate persona changes from product development, where it's sort of engineering and introspective, to sales, which is very extroverted. The personality changes. And oftentimes the people who are great at managing, sales forces, not so good managing engineers and the technical side of things. So if you're experienced with it, that's great, but you have to have other co-founders or be willing to bring on other people at the right time. And maybe that means you as a CEO transitions down to CTO at some point, and you bring in somebody who's done commercial launches multiple times. Those are some of the things that investors are looking at. So if you go into like a Series A pitch and you say, I'm going to run this thing until it gets liquid, and they look at you and say, but you're 16 years old and you've never run a company, you've never taken investor money, and you've never gotten liquid on it, we don't know if we can trust you to manage the $17 million we're going to put into you right now. So if you go into it instead and say, hey, I know when I've reached my point, I've got 3 people that are on my advisory board. Any one of them is capable of coming in and running the company going all the way forward because they've already done this before. That's pretty comforting to the investor. By the same token, you might have an investor come in and say, we'll let you run it, but once we start getting ready to build a sales force, we're going to put in one of our entrepreneurs in residence who's done this 3 times and did it really, really well for us, made us a boatload of money. We're going to install him as CEO. You okay with that? And if you say no, conversation's over. They'll get up and walk off. But if you're open to that and say, yes, but I got to meet the person, we got to make sure he meshes well with the team and stuff like that. That's a pretty good sign for coachability for the management team. So that's at least some of the ways that you can kind of maximize your ability to take advantage of the investment money that comes in. The other part is you really need to make it very clear that you have articulated all the different value-added milestones so that you can articulate to the investor, okay, we're going to go through and we're going to do proof of principle and benchtop testing to show that this thing will actually create ultrasound images through bone. You can do that on the benchtop. Well, that's pretty good for, to a certain extent of de-risking the technology, but then you're going to need to do something else a little bit further down the road. It's either a preclinical study or a cadaver study. That takes away some more risk if you're successful with it, but it takes more time and more expense. So you need to lay out an entire timeline of all these little things that you need to do as a company to take away product risk, market risk, regulatory risk, and there's several other types of risk, but there are certain things that if you achieve it, you can say, I got it. We know the technology works, or we got it. We got our 510K. The regulatory risk is gone. Now all we've got is the risk that we can't sell this to the people who've got the money to buy it.
Yeah.
So that hopefully goes over that a little bit.
And the one other thing I would add that will help make you a lot more successful is researching and vetting the people who you seek out and try to pitch to. If they don't invest in healthcare, they're going to say, come back when you have sales, if they want you to come back at all. Understand what stage they typically invest in and the types of deals they've done before and what proportion of their portfolio is healthcare. Because if they've done 20 deals and one was one health IT company and you're pitching them a medical device, you're going to waste your time, even if you get to diligence, because they're going to have a hard time getting a yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing I would add is if you can do it, find out how old their fund is.
Yeah.
Because if you're raising Series A and they're 5 years into that fund, they're not going to be interested in getting in your Series A because you've got too much time in front of you to get liquid for them. Because a fund only lasts 10 years. They have to have all their investments liquidated in 10 years from the start of the fund. So that's the other thing to look at is if you're Series D, yep, you can take somebody who's got a 5-year-old fund. But if you're Series A, you need somebody who just opened whose fund just got fully capitalized, within the last 12 to 18 months or so.
Yep.
All right. So now for the moment everybody's been waiting for, what happens to your founder's shares as you start raising money? Okay. So let's just take a look at a quick example. And these numbers are not unreasonable. And we're going to do it all in terms of common stock. So you have a founding CTO and CEO, and you're going to you're going to create a C-Corp with 3 million shares in it, and you're going to divvy it up 60-40. So the CTO has got 60%, 1.8 million shares. All right, that's great. Well, let's say you have to license some IP from Georgia Tech or Emory or someplace like that. Well, here's what happens is they typically are going to want about 8% of the equity in the company. And this is negotiable, but oh boy, they really want to push it as close to 10% as they can get it. And they're going to want royalties and minimums and a bunch of other stuff. But the 8% comes in, and now you've got to issue more shares. You got to, in this case, you got to issue about another 261,000 shares to cover that. All right, so your 60% just dropped to 55%. Doesn't look too bad. All right, so there we are, and now you're about to go get some investors. Now the investors who are smart are going to say, you need to create a stock option pool so that you can hire new employees and you can do equity-based compensation for them. And you're going to want to do that too, because you want your employees to have equity in the company because it aligns everybody's incentives in the same direction. So a typical option pool that's going to get requested is 20%. So now you're going to put that in place. Well, you got to go issue a whole bunch more shares. In this case, 800,000 shares. And now you've got total of 4 million shares of common stock. So your 60% has dropped to 44%. That's okay. Now, one of the misnomers that a lot of people look at this 20% stock option pool and go, oh my God, it's 20% of the company's gone. It's not gone until you issue every one of those shares in a stock option grant and they all get exercised and the stock now is owned by employees and contractors. If there's still, out of that 800,000 shares, let's say you've only done stock option grants on half of it, so 400,000 of it's been issued and everybody exercises it and you get acquired, 400,000 shares will just go away. So the full option pool doesn't hurt you in the effect of an acquisition unless it's totally vested and it's been exercised. So anything that's authorized but unissued, don't worry about it. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when you take on board some angel investors. So here they come. You can see on the bottom left, that's where we were after the stock option pool was put in place. And let's say in this particular case, you're going to take some money from angels. They're going to end up with 11% of the company at that point. They get 500,000 shares. Now, what's interesting is if the angels made you put that 20% stock option pool in place, then they'll do that before they put their money in. And it's smart on their part. You don't like it as an entrepreneur. And the reason for that is, had that 20% not gone into place before they put in their money, they would have only gotten 400,000 shares, not 500,000 shares. That's what that 20% did. And every venture capitalist that you meet, when they go in to do a series A, B, C, whatever, they're going to want to see that stock option pool pushed up. They're going to say, we want 20%, but I'm going to tell you, you can argue 10 to 15% is all you need. That's all we ever did at Focal. We controlled our option pool very, very tightly. And so we never had to issue or authorize that huge option pool, which meant that we didn't end up giving more shares to the venture investors than was necessary. So that's the only time that stock option pool size that can hurt you. If you let it go to the full 20% and you can make a pretty good justification, you're never going to use 20%. All right, so that's the angels. They come in a convertible note at that point. It's going to convert. This is all done on a fully diluted basis, but it's going to convert at the next round. All right, so let's take a look at what you own after Series A. So you can see in the top, this is where we were just at the last slide, and down here is where we are. We're going to do a Series A, and the Series A investors, they're going to take 30% of the company, and they're going to get 2 million shares, and now you're up to 6.56 million shares, and you see your ownership's now dropped to 27%. Now you might look at that and go, oh, wow, I've really taken a hit. I'm now own less than half of what I did when I started the company. Well, the thing you got to remember is you own 60% of something that had a real value of 0. When you started the company, it didn't have any intangible or tangible assets whatsoever. At this point, you've brought in Series A investors. At least on paper, your company has a post-money value, and you now own 20% of that. Now, you're not going to get liquid on that, but now you actually have on paper some value. So it's always better to own a smaller percentage of something with tangible value than 100%, for example, of something with no value. And I can tell you that from Focal Therapeutics. When I started it, I was the only shareholder. I owned 100% of the company. It was worth 0 at that point. All right, so let's say you've done Series A, Series B, Series C. Let's see what happens to you now. So there's the summary over on the left down at the bottom. That's where we were after Series A. And now let's go ahead and drop in Series B and Series C. And on Series C, they're going to take 40% of ownership of the company. So now they're going to get, now you've got 24 million shares outstanding. and you can start to see what that's doing to your ownership. So here's what the venture people own. What is that? 66, they own 2/3 of the company. This happens almost every time. The investors will own the vast majority of the company. You, as the founding CTO, you're now down to 8%. So you dropped precipitously from what you did before, but your company's probably worth $200 million at this point. And if you've done that many shares, you're probably also commercial. You're probably also getting close to cash flow break even with significant revenues. If that's the case, your shares are worth about $16 million. And if you're a qualified small business, as a medical device company, you should be at this point. That $16 million, if you were able to get liquid on it today, is untaxed. Man, that's a beautiful outcome. So your option pool at that point, we had to pop it up again, but we argued to keep it down to just 18% of the company at that point. So again, you're at 8%, but that 8% is totally meaningful. So just a couple of caveats on this. This is a very, very simple thing. The founders never invested in any of the preferred rounds. So they raised 3 rounds of investment and they never put $1 in of their own. They probably, and since they were founders, they got their shares in return for assigning the IP over. So they didn't even pay $16 for their founder share. Zip, nothing. And they got no new stock option grants. More than likely, if those founding CTO and CEO stay on board and you do all these different rounds, you will get some stock option grants to help ease some of that dilution pain. So it may not be quite as bad as all that. All right, so I guess I have a little bit of some share price examples. We are almost totally done here. At Proxima, again, we sold that for $200 million. We raised $50 million in venture capital over 5 rounds. We started off our Series A was $1 a share. Then we had our B round was up, our C round was flat. So we did $240 a share for each of them. Then we did $480 a share and $720 a share. And when we got acquired, we still had about $8 million in the bank at that point. So yep, we sold it to SciTech Corp. And here's what the investor returns were. So, you know, I think I had money in every single one of these rounds. Wasn't a lot, but I had money in those, and I had stock option grants and some other things. But you can see the Series A, the people who put in the money at the lowest share price, but they had to wait the longest amount of time. They got a 14x return on their money. The Series E, you know, we sold it for essentially like $14.60 a share. The Series E shareholders, they had put their money in like not even 12 months before we got acquired. They got a 2x return on your money. I don't know any place you can get a 2x return on your money in less than 12 months. That's I mean, bully for them. But that's a the venture capitalists and the funds that go for Series A and B are totally different than the ones that will jump in at C or D or E. They have a totally different business model, totally different liquidation, waterfall, and preference. And it's just, they're just different animals. So you will end up having multiple funds. If you go this many rounds, you'll have at least 5 or 6 different funds invested in the company over that amount of time. So last thing I wanted to talk about is what's happened due to COVID-19. So PitchBook, which is an awesome reference for a lot of things and trends in venture capital across all the different segments, not only healthcare, IT, medtech, pharma, and then all of the other consumer products and other markets. But they'll break it down by round, and they'll give you pre-money values and all great statistics and show you how they trend over time. So what this chart is showing is the percentage of venture capital rounds starting in 2008 all the way up to 2019, last year. And the bottom bar is the up rounds, the percent that were up. The middle light blue is the flat rounds, and the top part, the dark blue, that's the down rounds. And what I want to point out here is these 3 years were the heart of that recession and downturn from 2008 to 2010. And the big thing to note here, in 2009, in the peak of it, 35% of all the rounds were down. And then there's like another 25% were flat. There was only 40% of the rounds were up in that space. We may be looking at a similar type of cratering in the investment market moving forward. But you don't see it in 2019 because COVID hadn't hit anything at that point. You can see that there were only 10% of all venture rounds were down in 2019. I mean, 2018 and 19 were just extraordinary years for pulling investment money out. What you have to be prepared for right now is if you can raise money, raise more than you think you need, you're going to get, everything is skewing back towards the investor. So you're going to get worse terms on preferences, liquidation preferences, governance, and you're going to get hammered on valuation as well. Don't let that stuff bug you because we're going to start coming out of this. The companies that survive in this type of very Darwinian environment, they do well. It's the ones that pop out, and we saw this leading up to like the year 2000, tech bubble. You had all these companies that were, going public, and they said, we're not even going to try to get profitable. We're just going to we're going to raise a lot of money and try to just take up market share. And those companies just got obliterated because they had shit for a business model, pardon my language. But the ones who stick to fundamentals and can show how you're going to make it to revenue and cash flow positivity, and you execute on what you said you're going to execute, those are the ones who are going to survive and they're going to do well. So with that, I'm done. And I hope I didn't leave you with a big Debbie Downer on things. This is a wonderful thing that you're all doing. And I applaud you heartily for going after it. So that's the way.
Great. Well, thanks so much, James. So if anyone has any final questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll just unmute you. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to do that. There's a lot to go through there. And while folks think on that a little bit, one of the other things I've been hearing about investment in COVID-19 era is VCs sitting on a lot of dry powder to reinvest in companies that they've already put funds into. Do you think that will help with any of the companies getting hammered on terms in the follow-on rounds?
This is the funny thing is if a venture investor has money in a startup, they put it in, say, Series A, they have an internal conflict of interest in Series B or Series C, because on the one hand, they're recurrent investors and they want the share price to be as high as possible, but because they're putting in new cash, they want the share price to be as low as possible. And all of a sudden they've got this internal conflict, which is the classic VC dilemma that as founders, we also need to be aware of, that VCs may not make decisions that are always in the company's best favor. So I know I'm sort of morphing off of your question a little bit, but I think this is kind of an interesting thing to understand, particularly if you've got a VC board member who got a late fund, is like 6 year, 7 year, 8 year, they're going to start, anytime you have any issue or somebody, you're not doing well, or somebody gives you a lowball offer for the company, they're going to push really, really hard for you to sell right then. And you may be leaving a lot on the table because you're pretty close to achieving like a big clinical milestone or something like that.
Right.
So that's one thing to bear in mind. One of the things I have heard from the venture community is they are pulling term sheets actively right now.
Mm-hmm.
They had them in front of entrepreneurs, and they're just taking them off the table.
Right.
So, but the ones that have dry powder, they're going to want to see 2 or maybe 3 out of their 10 portfolio companies survive, because that's all that ever survive. And
right.
They're going to not invest in the ones that they think don't have a great shot, and they're going to concentrate their dry powder on those. So you may be able to get more funds from fewer investors, which means your roadshow is not as long and arduous, and you may have an easier time because you're only negotiating with a current investor over what the terms are going to be like. So for the ones who are meeting their objectives, I I think there's, anytime you got a huge challenge like this, there are opportunities in it, but you have to be prepared for it and ready to do, extraordinary things to make it happen.
Yeah. So we'll have this be maybe our last question. I'm trying to think of how to rephrase this. It has to do more with what advice would you give for an entrepreneur who is looking to, so kind of the reverse side maybe? So you're an entrepreneur, you're looking to go after some non-dilutive financing. How do you find the technology expert to be a credible PI on, let's say, an SBIR grant, or I'll broaden it even more widely, how do you surround your company with the technical expertise to get investment or be competitive for grant funding?
Okay, that's really kind of two different questions, but yeah. To find the technical experts, I think that's probably fairly straightforward. When I want to find out who really knows something about a particular clinical area or a technology, I'll go to PubMed and I'll do searches on whatever the technology is. And the first thing I'll do is I'll look for review articles, because usually it's the people who are the smartest about that and got the most experience, they write a review article. And because they get cited a lot. So I would look for, the first author is usually a young gun and an up-and-comer. The top 3 authors are usually the ones who did all the work, but it's this last author, that's the senior person, that's the KOL. That's the person I would probably look for. The second place you can do is you can go to whatever conference, let's say it's an anesthesia conference, go to the anesthesia conference and look at the track that you're most relevant to, and see who they have moderating the session. It's not the speakers, it's the moderators. They're usually the people, because they're going to have interesting questions. And so that's where I would go to try to find the technical or the clinical types of folks. Those are going to help you out with grants. Again, the technical side of things, when you're raising investor money, it's less about the technology and it's more about the experience and the business. I would be looking for people who are on the business side of it, who've got experience in that market segment. One of the things that's kind of nice, I've got almost all my experiences in breast surgery, breast radiation therapy. Consequently, if I started, when we started Focal Therapeutics, I had some sales reps that this was the 3rd time they worked for me. And I knew them. We hired them first when most of them were pretty young. Now when we hired them at Focal, they all had 20+ years experience, had deep relationships with the physicians who were buying the products, and they could just call them and say, I'm working for a new company. They got a brand new exciting thing. Can I come in and show it to you? And they got right in. Yeah. So it's more about, having the right experience and the people like that know how to execute on it. I think that will inure to your benefit far more on the investor side of it. I'd check the box on the technology, but it's the business side is gonna make the investors happy.
Excellent. Well, James, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. If folks have follow-up questions or they want to get in touch, what's the best way for them to find you? LinkedIn? What's that?
I'm on LinkedIn. You can connect or message me there. My email is Stubbs, Stubbs @gottech.edu. That's another way to do it. You can pepper James Raines with all kinds of questions and let him try to refer it. So,
well, thank you again. And this is a topic that we get questions about a lot, Biolosity, with the companies that we fund or that we are considering for funding. And so appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, this is awesome. Thank you for the opportunity. This is great, And I just look at it this way. You have done so many things for us, being guest judge and things like that for the BME group, leading up to Expo. So thank you for all you do for this entire ecosystem. It's just awesome to have somebody like you helping all of us out. So
I appreciate it. I paid him to say that, guys. And with that, with my ego nice and inflated, we'll let you all go. Thank you guys so much.